bor in Bing William Ato in Juba Malatori hey yo in Bing William Ato in Benti wala kwaju hey wow in Bing William Ato in Malkal wala Pinyaram in Bing William
Thank you so much, our viewers, wherever you are tuning in. Welcome to Lagos State Media Beyond Boundaries. And in the studio today with us is Professor Jok Madut Jok. And our conversation today will focus basically on Sudan and how the conflict in Sudan will affect South Sudan and what will happen to South Sudan in the near future. And with that regard, permits me to remind you once again, share this live show on your Facebook wall so that you can reach out to many South Sudanese to watch and also hear the thoughts and wisdom from Professor Jok Madut Jok. And allowed me to welcome Professor to give his opening remark before we dive into our conversation. And remind again, be with us. We will not take long. Our conversation will basically be within the range of 1 hour, 45 minutes, or 38 minutes. Thank you so much, Professor. Welcome to Lagos State Media. We really appreciate your time, and we don't take it for granted. The chance is yours to give us your opening remark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayok and Lagos State Media and the viewers for affording me the opportunity this morning to be in the studio with you and live on Lagos State Media Beyond Boundaries. I hope all is well out there. Our people are confronted with a lot of challenges, and I pray that everyone is able to survive out there with all the challenges that we face. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to me, and it's a great morning, and happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your opening remark and for wishing your fellow countrymen and women a safely month, and also to be taking care of each other for this time as the world is turning a safe place for humankind. Professor, we will move to the issue of at hand. Considering the crisis in Sudan, which took place on 15th of April last month, and it is now almost 1 month since such an unprecedented crisis broke out in Khartoum, and the damage this crisis caused within Khartoum and within the region. Kindly, can you elaborate more on that crisis? What does it mean if such crisis happen in Sudan to the people of South Sudan, which was at some point were one country and were one nation before South Sudan became independent in 2011? And considering South Sudan becoming a potential peace mediator between Sudan's warring parties since earlier 2020 to 2021, all the way until the broke out of recent crisis. Kindly, can you share your thoughts with the viewers and South Sudanese? Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. First of all, let us consider the current situation in Khartoum and nearby towns at the moment. It is now reported that over 600 people have died in this conflict, many of them targeted, others in crossfire, others dying because they could not make it to any hospital because the hospitals have been destroyed, looted, and occupied by warring parties, by the armies of the two sides. The humanitarian situation is dire. food supplies are quickly running out, and people are too afraid to go out of their homes to seek any food items to get water. There is no water in their homes. Electricity has been gone since the first 2 days of the conflict, and the humanitarian agencies, international NGOs, and UN and diplomats, foreign diplomats, have fled the country en masse. Currently, the government, as it were, the under Al Burhan, has shifted to Port Sudan as the center of government at the moment. The forces of Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, also known as Hameti, are currently roaming the streets in Khartoum. They are the ones basically occupying all the sensitive areas, including military bases like the Giat military industrial complex, the military headquarters in Khartoum near the airport in Khartoum International Airport, and the military base north of Khartoum, and also the oil refinery in north of Khartoum in near Shendi. So the situation is dire, to say the least. Then now people are asking, what is this? Sudan has never, at least Khartoum has never seen, or anywhere near the riverine Arab Central Power Base has never seen anything like this in their history. They have never seen a fight that goes into people's homes. It was always in the peripheries, in Darfur, in South Sudan, in southern Blue Nile, in Nuba Mountains, even in the Red Sea Hills, where such fights has taken place. Usually the government bringing that type of fight to the people in the peripheries. But for it to happen in Khartoum is unprecedented and has shocked everybody, including the rulers themselves. The elite of Sudan are shocked by this kind of conflict. So people are saying, why? What is this thing? Well, first of all, it is their own making. It is the elite of Sudan, especially the armed forces of Sudan, especially the ruling political parties from Ummah to NCP to other political parties in Sudan, who made this situation. It has been long coming, has been long in the making. In the past, these people that they are calling now militia, the Rapid Support Force, they are now calling it a militia. When it was killing people in Darfur on their behalf, it wasn't called a militia. When it was killing the Murahilin and the Janjaweed were attacking South Sudanese, they were not considered a militia. When they were given an entire mountain of Sudan's gold for them to mine and sell, they were not considered a militia. When they committed genocide on behalf of Khartoum government, they were considered part of the army, not a militia. But now, in the end, they disagreed. They said, we need to unify the forces because now there is a new roadmap to peace, to transition to a civilian government, and the army must be unified. When this peace process for unification was brokered by South Sudan, by Juba, they disagreed over the idea of army unification because Daglo or Hameti feared that unification will mean that his forces will be now subjugated to the Sudan armed forces, and with that they will lose their free reign that they had been given. They will lose control of gold resources, which Hameti controls. They would lose the source of money that they have been tapping, like getting paid by UAE and Saudi Arabia to join the coalition in Yemen against the Houthis, to sending fighters to Libya and Libyans giving them arms. The General Haftar of the Libyan National Army, there east of Libya, they would lose all these things. And therefore, in the end, they will be held accountable for the crimes they have committed in Darfur over the years. And they didn't want that prospect. So the fighting that is going on in Khartoum today, you could say that it is chickens haven't come home to roost. They created it, and the monster is now trying to consume its maker. So that is the situation currently in Sudan. The second question people ask, what is going to stop it? How is it going to stop? Well, the international community has made pleas to them, starting with the African Union, with the IGAD, and then with USA, and then with the Gulf Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, all making pleas to the warring generals to at least have a temporary ceasefire so that people caught in crossfire can flee if they want to leave, so that humanitarian agencies can bring in aid. And they agreed to a lull in the fighting for 72 hours. This was 2 weeks ago. And the fighting didn't stop. It was extended for another 72 hours, and the fighting continued. And it was suggested that IGAD would send President Salva Kiir of South Sudan to mediate between the two generals. But in the end, this did not materialize. And instead, USA and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have managed to persuade the two warring parties to seek a political settlement and to meet, at least initially, and to see whether there can be a ceasefire that can allow humanitarian aid to be delivered. Because right now people are desperately in need of everything, basic, from medicines to food, to access to water, to revive electricity, to bring fuel for generators. Nothing is happening in Khartoum, and humanitarian agencies really desperately are trying to rescue the people of Sudan. So they have agreed to send delegations to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and with only a specific mandate. Both Daglo and Burhan have instructed their delegates to only go to Saudi Arabia to negotiate one and only one thing, and that is humanitarian corridors, humanitarian access, that there would be a temporary cessation of hostilities in certain areas so that aid can be delivered. That is all they are going to do. They are not going to talk any political settlement or power sharing or permanent ceasefire. They are not going to discuss that. They are only going to do the temporary passageways for humanitarian aid to come in. That is what they are negotiating now in Saudi Arabia. Because both of them are convinced, each one is convinced that they will defeat the other one militarily. General Daglo says he will not rest until he has either killed Burhan or has apprehended him. And he said on his new social media platforms that he has now created, apparently we are told that Daglo has hired a media company in UAE to help its propaganda on social media. So he now has a very elaborate Twitter account, and on that he said that Al Burhan will die like a dog. We will catch him, and he will die like a dog. That is not a language of somebody interested in a peaceful settlement. The rhetoric is similar on the other side. So what is going to happen if there is a settlement to allow humanitarian aid to go into Sudan? What will happen now will to continue to seek venues for a real negotiation about ending the conflict and resolving the issue. Whether Saudi Arabia and USA will continue to be the mediators for that level is still unknown. Burhan has just sent the Undersecretary for Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sudan to Juba to meet with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in South Sudan and eventually to meet the president, probably today. The goal there is to, and he has reported that he has been instructed and given a message by Burhan to deliver to President Salva Kiir, asking him to intervene in this fight and to try to convince Daglo to come to the table. So there is still hope that South Sudan will still be consulted as a potential mediator, given, as you said in your opening remarks, South Sudan is closer to Sudan, not just physically, not just geographically, but historically, and also in terms of shared. The two countries were one country not long ago. South Sudan understand the history. President Salva Kiir himself used to be a member of the Sudan Armed Forces personnel, so he knows Sudan, and that is the basis on which both Juba and Khartoum feel that Juba should be able to mediate this with ease. Now, there is a problem with South Sudan being able to mediate, and the problem is South Sudan does not have that much regional political clout or power or weight, as you wish. And so whether the whole region will rally behind South Sudan in order to be the mediator in Sudan is not very clear, given that South Sudan is suffering its own problems. The other problem is South Sudan has got no money. The reason why they are in Saudi Arabia, part of the reason they are in Saudi Arabia today is that they trust Saudi Arabia better, and the Sudanese trust Saudi Arabia to be able to chip in financially to the peace talks, but also to potential reconstruction should the war end. Saudi Arabia has already announced that they have put up $100 million for humanitarian efforts in Sudan. So on account of wealth, South Sudan is not being seen by Sudanese, by Khartoum, by both fighters, by both warring parties. They don't see South Sudan really having a lot of capacity to mediate. Thirdly and lastly, I think we sometimes forget that the war that South Sudan fought against Sudan was also having racial overtones and having religious Islamic overtones. And so with Northern Sudanese being usually very, very disrespectful of South Sudanese on account of race and religion, South Sudan is not being seen there with an eye of being the real mediator for Sudanese conflict. I think those issues will make it hard for South Sudan to be a mediator. But you never know. South Sudan was already mediating since 2020, when Sudan when the forces of protest, political protest called um, uh, Forces for Freedom and Change overthrew al-Bashir. Both General Daglo and General Burhan eventually managed to side with the protests and then hijack the power, and they installed themselves as head of state, Burhan head of state and Daglo being deputy, and they essentially hijacked the revolution. But South Sudan was mediating the possibility of a return to a civilian rule. And this mediation, this peace process had established a kind of a roadmap to that. And now it has been cut short by this outbreak of violence. Whether the warring parties will go back to that is really unknown. Because peace, in order to bring peace, you can only bring peace if the warring parties want peace. And any peace agreement that will be achieved, or any cessation of hostilities that will be achieved in Sudan, will only be as good as the warring parties want it. If they don't want it, there is no way South Sudan can manage it, or any other party. And so long as they are committed to winning in military terms, there will be no room for negotiation. Finally, let me just say that the longer this conflict goes on in Sudan, right now it has spread to Darfur. Even there were reports the other day that it is also happening in South Kordofan. The longer it goes on, the more difficult it will be for Sudan to remain one country. The possibility of Sudan disintegrating further, so that there will be a state in Darfur, there will be another state in Kordofan, another state in Eastern Sudan. This disintegration is looming large, especially if this conflict goes on much longer. Because the thing that war does is that it hardens people's positions. So the more destruction and the more killing, the more likely people will not want to remain the same, to remain one. We used to warn Sudan that if you continue along the same path of racism, of marginalization, of exclusion of the peripheries, as you did all these years since 1950s, most likely it is not going to be possible for Sudan to remain a unified country. And sure enough, South Sudan is gone. But they have not changed their attitudes towards the Nuba, towards the Fur, towards the Zagawa, the Masalid, the Nuba, the Angasna, the Nubians in the north and the Beja in the east. They have not changed their attitude. They are still seeing those people in the same way that they used to see South Sudan. So what is going to prevent those people from seeking to break away from that union? Because it's a union that does not include them. It's a union that is based on racial and religious exclusionary system. So I think Sudan is in jeopardy. Sudan is at a crossroads at the moment. And we think it is not going to be contained within the borders of Sudan. It is going to spill over to other countries in a variety of different ways. Chad is having similar problem, and the tribes that are in Sudan within Darfur have their members within the Chadian territory. There is a possibility of a crisis there. Now they are saying about 50,000 people have gone to southern Egypt, and they will become a major humanitarian challenge there as refugees. Some people have already gone to Eritrea. About 10,000 people from northern Sudan have gone to South Sudan already. So in terms of refugee flight into neighboring countries, it will bring challenges to those countries. This is very clear that this war is not just going to affect Sudan. it will also affect the neighboring countries in so many different ways. Lastly, I think it is important to say, how is this war going on in Sudan directly affecting South Sudan? Because we are South Sudanese, we are concerned about it. Well, there are three immediate ways in which this war in Sudan is as much damaging to Sudan as it is to South Sudan. Three main ways. One, and this is the most important one, in fact, people might disagree, and that is Sudan remains South Sudan's biggest trading partner. All the food supplies and commodities and fuel, construction material, other necessities, at least the ones that go to Upper Nile, to Unity State, to Warab, to Northern Bahr Ghazal, all the northern states, they get supplied from Sudan. And now those supplies in Sudan have dried up. So where will those northern areas of South Sudan, where will they get their supplies this time? Because South Sudan is almost 100% an import economy. It doesn't produce anything. It imports everything. So if there is no supplies coming from Sudan, where is South Sudan going to get them? Yes, of course, you can think of Ethiopia, you can think of Kenya, you can think of Uganda, but the distance from those borders to the northern states of South Sudan with very poor infrastructure, road infrastructure, is going to make it very difficult to supply those areas from the south. This is very, very important, especially this year. This year, the harvest was very poor, almost throughout, at least the northern half of South Sudan, from lakes to further north to Unity and Upper Nile and to the parts of Jonglei, to Warab and northern Bahr Ghazal, there were flooding, and the flooding destroyed crops, and people are desperately in need of food right now. So when you put on top of that the lack of supplies coming from Sudan, South Sudan is very likely going to face a massive humanitarian crisis. This month, next month, July and August will be very, very desperate times for South Sudanese in terms of food, at the very least. Not to say anything about medications that come from Egypt through Sudan. Not to say anything about fuel that is needed for production, for everything, for mobility. So it's going to be a massive problem for South Sudan, especially if that war continues to rage the way we think it might. That's one immediate consequence of Sudan's war for South Sudan. The second one, and this is why I thought maybe people will disagree with me making that one number one, is the passage of oil. The pipeline from the oil fields passing through Sudan going to Port Sudan. So far, the pipeline is not affected. The oil is still flowing. Most definitely because whether you are a Hameti or Burhan, you need that oil to be sold so that you get your share of the fees that Sudan collects from South Sudan's oil. But there is no telling. If the war gets desperate, the losing side might think of jeopardizing the oil supply, oil export, as a way to affect the other. So we are not out of the woods with regards to flow of oil. And if the oil export stops, essentially the government of South Sudan will come to a standstill. There will be nothing in South Sudan because oil still constitutes more than 90% of the revenue. The revenue that is collected from other sources doesn't make it to the treasury. It gets stolen by people in charge. And that is a different story we can talk about another time. The third problem of course, is our people who had fled their own fire in South Sudan in 2013, in 2016, and went to Sudan as refugees or IDPs. And now there's fire in Sudan, they are fleeing back. Unfortunately, they are fleeing back into fire still, as peace has not been implemented in South Sudan, and resources, the economy has been destroyed by terrible policies under President Salva Kiir. And so, what are these people going to go back to? Already, the government, represented by the acting Minister of Foreign Affairs, Deng Dao Deng Malek, announced that the population of returnees from Sudan is too huge for the government of South Sudan to afford to help them. So basically, the government has decided that it has no capacity, or it does not have the will to receive its own citizens coming back from Sudan. In fact, people joke about this, and it's not a joking matter. You remember there was something called Malesh Bashir. Some camps, some refugee camps in Sudan were named Malesh Bashir. These were South Sudanese supposedly saying to al-Bashir, Malesh, we have seceded from Sudan, and yet we are still needing you. So now some elements in the government of South Sudan are saying, well, if these people are coming back, they should first say Malesh Bankir before they can be taken back. Because people think, there are some government officials who think that our people who fled to Khartoum are enemies, when in fact they were just poor people caught in fighting and had no choices but to seek refuge in Sudan. Now they are coming back, and without any support from the government, with humanitarian agencies already having their hands full because of hunger, and because there are already displaced persons, so many. There is something called protection of civilian sites. There's one in Wau, there's one in Juba, there's one in Bor, there's one in Bantiu, there's one in Malakal. In fact, there are two in Juba. Not to say anything about all the other IDP camps like in the north, like in Yida and so forth. Humanitarian agencies already have their hands full. So they will have limited capacity to respond to the influx of refugees from Sudan. This is the third most important direct consequence of Sudan's war on South Sudan. There are others, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your analysis. Actually, you have covered most of the questions which were supposed to be asked and seek answers and analysis on your end. And you have entirely covered all of them, of which you narrated the genesis of Sudan conflict and how it has really affected already the neighboring states, and basically how heavy the impact and repercussions on South Sudan currently, and as we move forward. You talk about the two important key issues, the issue of economy, South Sudan becoming a defender on Sudan, and other neighboring states like Uganda and Kenya. You have also talked about the returnees, South Sudanese themselves, and also Sudanese who are seeking refuge in South Sudan. But when we look at the political angle, Prof, we also need your wisdom on that. You mentioned that South Sudan was a potential mediator of Sudanese conflict for the last 3 years before this unprecedented conflict broke out last month. And you have mentioned that Saudi Arabia present herself as a potential mediator over other African countries. based on two accounts. Number one, that country has wealth. Like $100 million have already offered for the humanitarian assistance, of which South Sudan and other countries could not even afford $20 million to offer to their neighbors. On the same note, they are also on the same religion section, of which they always understand the context of their conflict firmly more than other Christian denomination. Prof, can you tell us where does South Sudan still fit here? As you mentioned, Brand sent one of his cabinet secretaries to South Sudan to meet with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and also meet with the President Salva Kiir, seeking for their intervention and how to persuade Hamiti to accept the dialogue. Now, South Sudan from the genesis present herself as the rightful person in this case, looking at the historical relation with Sudan and also the previous negotiation, which was actually based at Juba. How does South Sudan fit here? You need to give us analysis on that, alongside the political impact of Sudan conflict over South Sudan.
Right.
Remember, we were two patients. South Sudan is another patient, treating Sudan as another patient. And while we were in the hospital treating each other, one patient's sickness gets serious, the one of Sudan, while South Sudan is still on the bed. So how do they help each other here? Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. That's a very great analogy you have made. Two sick individuals trying to help each other. Who is going to be more capable of helping the other? It's a great analogy, and you are completely on point with regards to where does South Sudan fit in? If UAE and Saudi Arabia are both Arab and Muslim, which is the identity of most people in northern Sudan now, not most people, but those in power, see themselves as Arab and of course Muslim. So the possibility of them preferring those countries as mediators over South Sudan is there. In addition to the wealth that these countries are able to offer. So where does South Sudan really come in? Well, first of all, South Sudan is looking for a positive story about herself, because South Sudan has failed to implement her own peace agreement to the point where this peace agreement in South Sudan called ARCIS and its extension and the so-called roadmap, which was put together last year, this peace agreement has become the best way for President Salva Kiir and his allies, along with a few opposition people like those in SPLA, SPLM-IO, and those in other political parties. It has become the best way for them to stay in power for eternity. And therefore, it pays for them to keep the country in the limbo, not in peace and not necessarily in war. That is the best way that they can stay in power. And I think they are going to maintain that. And as a result, international community does not trust the leaders of South Sudan as people who can bring peace to other countries, since they cannot even bring one for their own people. And politically, I think that is where the challenge, the political challenge for South Sudan, is that issue of image. A country which has all its ethnic communities warring among themselves, and a country that cannot treat its sick people, and only people with access to government money are able to travel abroad to get medical attention, whereas the rest of the people rot in misery within South Sudan. A country that cannot, a government that cannot afford to feed its own hungry population, despite the fact that it is a wealthy country, it's an oil-producing country, has lush agriculture land, it has the river, the world's longest river passing through it, and has minerals and gold, and yet these resources are being exploited illicitly, and they are being exploited to the benefit of a few. That country has lost a kind of image and respect from the world, because what kind of a government would sit on so many resources, and yet foreigners are coming in to feed the people, the citizens of South Sudan? Right now, over 90% of healthcare workers are paid by international agencies. Teachers don't get paid, and the few that get paid are in schools supported by international aid. What kind of a country where a single leader sits in office for 18 good years and no prospect of transitioning to democracy? So South Sudan does not really have any political image that is positive in the eyes of the world. And you know, in order for a country to be respected, it is much respected because of internal stability, internal welfare of people. If you take care of your house, you take care of your children, and your children are looking nice, well dressed, well fed, attending school and getting vaccinated, if you take care of your own immediate family, you yourself, Majok, you will get respect from everybody. Not because there is something you do to those people, but because they're like the kind of person who takes good care of his own immediate family. So if you use that analogy to consider Salva Kiir and his government as the head of this household called South Sudan, and yet his children are not eating, and they are dying of preventable diseases, they are not getting dressed, they are not getting taken to the hospital, who do you think which neighbor is going to respect South Sudan? The Kenyans already insult South Sudanese as people who go to make money in South Sudan and then take it to spend it in Kenya. The same for you people in Uganda. Every government official with any kind of weight in the government and has access to resources of the public resources, they have their families abroad in the neighboring countries. So no one really thinks of South Sudan politically as a weighty country. South Sudan is only a hunting ground for all those countries to come in to get resources, but they will never accord South Sudan the respect it deserves, the respect that it should have. And without that respect, South Sudan cannot be seen as a successful mediator. The only reason why Hameti and Burhan allowed President Kiir and his people in the past to mediate was because of cronyism, because they were interested in the resources of South Sudan. South Sudan was a place where Hameti took his dirty money to launder it in South Sudan by giving it to South Sudan, by giving it to some individuals within the government. And then in exchange for that money, he was given crude oil. And then he goes and sells the crude on an open market globally, and his money is clean. That was the only reason why Hameti and Burhan were interested in Juba as a mediator, because they were using it as a way to launder the money. There's no any other reason. There's no political respect. There is no religious respect. There is no racial respect. There's only access to resources. And that is why you find that President Kiir is always putting people like Tut Galwag Manime, who is a former NCP person, putting people like Dr. Dio Mathok Dingwall, who was a former NCP, as the committee that is mediating, because these people speak the same language with the Northerners, and they are the conduit through which this money laundering is being done. That is the only reason why you see Sudan having been invited to be a mediator in the past. But I don't think there will be any more basis now for them to respect South Sudan.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that analysis. It's actually up to date, and it's upon our viewers to understand the context of your information. And indeed, once a nation lost reputations and respect, then it's very hard for neighbors to trust that country. Prof, we have only 2 questions to go, and to our viewers, be patient with us. We are almost ending the show. The second last question, Prof, is what will happen to South Sudan? Now
This
it
is
happened in Sudan, and it actually happened in other Central African Republic, and several things like what happened in Sudan are happening in West Africa.
Absolutely.
South Sudan is now in its own crisis, trying to manage it based on what they normally call a revitalized agreement, which was rebranded actually as roadmap. And the leaking information or the confidential information currently is that there is another second roadmap people are trying to lobby for. Literally, what you said earlier is what some of our government officials are trying to take it as the best refuge camp for them to manage the country, renewing agreement after the renewal, extending after the extension. What will happen to South Sudan while the roadmap is telling us that by next year, December, we should be preparing for the elections, and by 2025, February, we should be having a new democratic elected government in place? What will happen to South Sudan? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll be brief on these 2 questions, 2 linked questions. If you look at the situation now in South Sudan, basically we are a country still at war with each other, right? Within ourselves. So there are armed groups that are still out there. There are very unhappy. The population is completely unhappy. Even when you see violence, and sometimes they may call it a criminal violence, they may call it a tribal violence. What the correct view on that violence is that this is a form of protest against the situation that is prevailing today. It's a protest against this distorted economy, which is a clientele type of economy, basically centering around President Kiir. And there are no prospects for people to ever get access to resources so long as such an economy remains. If you look at the way the peace agreement is being used as to extend the lifespan of the government of Salva Kiir, you will find that people are very, very unhappy with this situation. My view is that there is a very genuine and imminent threat that South Sudan is going back to an all-out war. Who is going to be fighting whom is not very clear yet, but war is not behind us. This is what is going to happen from now up to about a year. I'm seeing that there is going to be a major crisis, political and military crisis. That means there will be no elections. And anybody holding his or her breath that elections will be held next year, at the end of next year, is simply living in denial. There will be no elections so long as Salva Kiir and Riek Machar are leading this ship, are sailing this ship, because it is not in their interest to hold elections. It is not in their interest to implement the peace agreement. They like chaos because chaos pays. Chaos is what pays them politically and financially. So long as there is chaos, they will say, oh, there is too much insecurity, we cannot hold elections. They will say, oh, there is not enough money for us to do the census and to demarcate the constituencies and to do the constitution and to hire electoral committees and to implement an election, to execute an election. They will simply say it's not possible. It's not feasible logistically, in terms of security, in terms of finance. We are not going to be able to hold elections. And if that becomes the case, you will see that people will not sit well with that. There will definitely be outbreak of violence as a result. But even if they force it to hold it, they will hold it before they have unified the army. They will hold it before they have counted the people. So they will not know for sure which constituencies are we having elections for. And if they continue forward with it, very likely the SPLM will rig it to its favor, and the opposition will be unhappy, and they will go to war over it. No question about it. So South Sudan is now in the middle. To hold elections or not to hold elections is going to be the question. To hold elections, you have a threat of violence if it is not transparent and fair. To not hold elections, people are going to be unhappy, and there could be a risk of war. So that is what is going to happen. And I don't think our leaders are willing to read the writing on the wall. What is keeping South Sudan in this volatility is theft of public resources, is shrinking of the political space, it's the lack of dialogue. So we think South Sudan government, especially the president himself, should revisit the national dialogue, should seek conversation with all the opposition forces, because talking is better than risking war. And unless President Kiir is willing to let down a little bit of his arrogance, thinking that he has defeated everyone and he's now going to rule forever, he is putting the country in jeopardy. So we think a president who has spent most of his years fighting for liberation of South Sudan should not allow the country to disintegrate on his hands, because then that will wipe away his legacy. I think it's important for Salva Kiir to maintain his patriotism that took him to war and say to the people of South Sudan, let us sit and talk. Insisting otherwise is simply to be unpatriotic and risk the jeopardizing the whole country, especially with the current war in Sudan, which, if it continues, will mean that there will continue to be supply of weapons across the borders to all the militia of South Sudan, to all the armed groups that are still out there, like the SPLA, SPLM-IO, Kidguang group, like all the other armed groups that are still out there, will have access to weapons through Sudan's war. So far, South Sudan has not been having access to weapons because of the arms embargo, the UN arms embargo. In a way, it has worked. And I think it was a good decision to put South Sudan on arms embargo. But with Sudan's war, there will be leakage of weapons from Sudan into South Sudan, and that will simply destabilize the country further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. Follow-up question to that. Is South Sudan government proactive or the passive in regard to the issue of ABI? Can they take advantage of what is happening now in Sudan to actually try to renew the issue of Abyei, or Abyei is becoming a forgotten size on both sides, Sudan and South Sudan, because we are now battling with our own issues in South and also in Sudan. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. Well, the current war going on between Ngok and Twitch is an example of the passiveness of Juba towards Abyei and lack of proactive thinking. Because that war is really a useless war, which Salva Kiir himself could have stopped very easily if he had genuinely intervened and called the two communities and say, what are you really fighting over when you are one people? I think this war would have been nipped in the bud long time ago. But President Kiir has been very passive and made a mistake of creating a committee to investigate it. But that committee was made up of Dr. Diuma Thok Ding and one of the vice presidents, Abdul Baghi, and that was the wrong committee. You needed to have created a committee made up of people who know Abyei and know Twitch better, especially former fighters like Bonabang Dol, for example, just to think of one person who has worked there as a military leader. People like Majanga God, people who have governed that territory, people like Nyaldeng. If these people were the ones put in charge of mediating the Abyei issue with Twitch, that war would have ended long ago. But that is an example of how South Sudan is not very keen on ensuring that Abyei returns peacefully to where it belongs, to South Sudan. Now is the right time to not only to think about Abyei, but to think of all the other occupied areas bordering Sudan, from Kapia Kenji to Magenis to all these other places like Kiradem and Mile 14. This is the time for South Sudan, and this has been suggested by many people to the government, that right now, while Sudanese are duking it out among themselves, it is time for us to claim our territories. But Juba has not responded, and Juba is not thinking. South Sudan is being encroached upon, and the government is not responding. Uganda has moved into territories in South Sudan. Kenya has expanded its control of the Ilemi Triangle and moving very, very fast into new site while we watch. And this is very unfortunate. And sadly, Abyei, if it is not resolved now, while Sudan is in crisis, it will be very difficult to resolve it any other time. I think now is the time for South Sudan to send its forces to the area and reclaim these territories. And then when Sudan is over with its war, we will be talking in a different language by that time.
Thank you so much, Professor Jok Madut Jok, for your analysis and your thoughts, which you share today with the fellow South Sudanese and most especially with Sudanese who have actually been talking about the crisis in Sudan and how the Sudan conflict will really affect the neighboring state. With this remark, kindly I will give you a chance to give us your opening remark, and I will request my co-host Abraham Adenmajak to come to the studio and also give word of appreciation on behalf of Lagos State Media before we end our show. Give us your last parting shot and your last message to the government of South Sudan, because the government always listen to its people. Is the government that shape its policies, and if government does not listen to the people, and then the policies will always be politically motivated. And once the policies are politically motivated, they will not benefit the masses of the people in that country. Yeah. Thank you so much, Prof, and the chance is yours.
Thank you, Majok, and thank you.
Before Professor Jok,
Yeah.
before you put on your closer remark,
Okay.
we always, legislative media always give our audience a chance to ask our guests a question. So I would like to pull up only 3 questions at the comment section, if that would be okay. I have one question come from Miss. Let me pull it up. One question is coming up from Miss Jerry in YouTube. From YouTube, he asking you, how can you take advantage when this is a national case? And question number 2 coming from Makur is asking you, what if the SPLM called for international observe, including the United Nations, UN, and African Union, AU, and European Union, EU, to justify election controversy? That is number 2. Number 3, the last one is coming from Galaxy, which is, I know her personal name, but I will not close it like this now. She's asking you this. So, Professor suggested that for the government to ignore the international law agreement that is in place regarding the BIA referendum. So, that question comes between your comment between BIA and tweet crisis. So those are the 3 questions.
I think the question 1 and 3 are the same about the international law and the fact that ABIA is internationally known as a contested area. First of all, ABIA held its elections, its referendum, as it was stipulated in the peace agreement in the PCA. In the peace agreement that ended the conflict between North and South. So in the CPA, that election was held, and they voted overwhelmingly to join South Sudan, but the government of Sudan rejected it, which was a violation of the law. So South Sudan taking ABI will not be a violation of the law because they have done what was stipulated in the agreement. And the Sudan government was the one in violation of that. And so it would not be a problem at all in terms of international law. Because what international law, if the Masiria backed by the government all these years have been attacking and killing, occupying Abyei town itself. Where was international law when Abyei people were being killed? When the Sultan of Abyei, the son of Deng Majok, was killed? Which international law was there to protect the people of Abyei? Even in with the presence of a UN mission there from Ethiopia, the UNISFA, the people of Abyei have continued to bleed. And so I don't think international law considerations are really an obstacle for South Sudan to reclaim what belongs to South Sudan. It's a matter of asserting oneself. It's not a violation. And even if some people think it's a violation, the occupation of Abyei itself is a violation by Sudan. So that is that, to answer both questions. In terms of the second question, which was about what if elections were sponsored, monitored, and conducted by international bodies from EU to African Union to UN. Well, sure, if there was that political will and interest from those entities, if they were to do it, sure, it would give that election some credibility. But will they do it? What is in it for them? If the leaders of the country don't want elections, how can international bodies just impose it? My response to it is that unless South Sudan is putting up its own elections and only asking for help, logistical help, financial help, I don't think it can be imposed on by international agencies. And in that way, I have to repeat that the reason why elections will not be held is because the government in place doesn't want them, because holding elections could be the end of their government, the end of holding office, because I think people would overwhelmingly vote against people currently in office, especially the SPLM. But to avoid that, they are simply going to drag their feet. They are going to obstruct. They are going to make excuses. Juba is going to make many excuses for reasons why elections were going to be difficult to be held. So that's my position. And just to conclude, I want to say thank you to Lake State Media. You always do a great job in covering some of the burning issues. So I appreciate you personally. But to South Sudanese, it's important for us to know, to realize, and to come to terms with this reality, this political reality, and that is no government anywhere in the world always does right on its own account for its people. People have to demand in order. So what I can say to the government of South Sudan, I should only say it to the South Sudanese themselves, that unless you unify your voices to challenge the current power structures and force them to do right by you, the prevailing power structures don't care about the citizens, and they will not do right, and they will continue to stay in office whether they are serving the people or not. They will stay in office for their own good. Unless South Sudanese speak with one voice, which is now a problem, and disunity is too much. South Sudanese are divided, and the disunity among South Sudanese along ethnic lines has become the strength of the government and has become a strategy of the government to deepen the divides so that people don't unite against them. And I think the onus is on the shoulders of South Sudanese themselves to demand what is their right, and demand it collectively and unanimously and with a loud voice through a variety of means. You can have a protest, you can have a social media campaign, you can send letters and do so collectively as unified people, because your destiny is the same. You all have a shared destiny. And if you continue to be divided the way that you are today, you're only making it easy for the current leaders to stay in office forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jok Madut. So now we'll hear microphone back from Jok. So then we close the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abraham Adit, for also reminding me about our culture. We always give chance to our audience, especially on the comment section, to give us their opinions and their questions, and also the clubhouse participants. Thank you so much for that. And to our viewers, we really appreciate your participations and coming always to listen to our viewers, to our guests, rather. It means a lot. Once you get information, it increases your thinking capacity. You will also analyze the information delivered by our guest, which is Professor Jok Madut, and see how best that information will help South Sudan and Sudan together. Thank you for that. It is our duty as a media online platform to provide you with the people who will share their knowledge, their experience, and their wisdom with us as South Sudanese, because a society that people always talk, it is a society that always find its solutions. And if we don't speak, then We will always be in crisis, and we will always be in confusion. With those few remarks, we really thank you so much on behalf of Lagos State Media, Professor Jok Madut. Thank you so much. Keep doing what you are doing, and we will continue inviting you more to discuss many things, including the culture of Jiang, which is now fading away while we are moving toward modernization and building the nation. We'll still have a very nice show, of which we will invite you with some other few or 2 or 3 people to come and talk about the Jiang culture. What does it mean? The Jiang of 2005 before CPA and the Jiang of 2011 after the independence. Thank you so much. I will lead it back to Abraham Adit to give his last remark while closing our show. May God bless you all, and may God bless South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Jok, and thank you, Professor Jok Madut, for coming in. And thank you all our viewers who were watching Clubhouse, Facebook, and YouTube. We will see you next time. May God bless you all. May God bless South Sudan.
Thank you.
Keep in peace.
God bless us.
In Juba, Malatori, Ayambio, in Ping William, in Benti, Walla Quaju, Ayawao, in Ping William, in Malkal, Walla Pinyaram, in Ping William.